Good evening and welcome to the Friday Symposium of the LaRouche organization. I'm Diane Sayre and it is Friday, April 18th today, which happens to be Good Friday as well as another important anniversary, which we will get to. Just to begin, I want to say a couple of things about the shift in the world. Some people are beginning to realize that they should promote more widely the words and wisdom of Lyndon LaRouche. And one article that came out a couple of days ago in the New Eastern Outlook, do you have that slide? Is an article on the headline, Economy. This is I believe, a Russian-based publication in English. The LaRouche Outlook, on the bankruptcy of Western economic models. And the author writes, no conscious or conscientious person can ignore the disastrous contemporary state of Western and U.S. economies and its real financial system structural failure and actual economic bankruptcy. And I will say, as some of you may be aware, there's a statement posted now on the LaRouche organization website and on the Schiller Institute site, making the point that LaRouche warned about this crisis and that Wall Street is who should be being penalized, not the producers, not the American people, not foreign countries who did not cause the bankruptcy of the United States, but our own foolish policies. And this has been quite a struggle over many years in this nation, but we'll be hearing more about that later. Also on the LaRouche question, I would like to play for you a few words from Sergei Glaziev, who is now the director of the Russian-Belarus Union, just having been promoted. He's a very, very important Russian economist, and he came to know and study the work of Lyndon LaRouche decades ago when he was a student in the United States. And he made a short video message on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of LaRouche's birth in 1922. If we could just hear the first minute and a half.
This year, progressive people around the world are observing the centenary of the birth of the brilliant thinker, and I wouldn't hesitate to say prophet of our time, Lyndon LaRouche. Unfortunately, we no longer can converse with him, and it's a pity he did not live to see the day when his warnings about the crash of the world financial system came to pass. Already 30 years ago, and perhaps even earlier, Lyndon LaRouche drew attention to the fact that the inflation of financial bubbles, including derivatives bubbles, and the creation of financial pyramid schemes would inevitably bring about the collapse of the world financial system. And he proposed to adopt timely measures to avert that collapse. If the leaders of the world's nations had listened to the voice of Lyndon LaRouche, then perhaps we might have managed to avoid the social upheavals we confront today as a result of the collapse of the world financial and economic system, which is based on unlimited emission of the dollar and other Western reserve currencies.
So clearly, leading thinkers in Russia are reflecting on the work and legacy and warnings of Lyndon LaRouche, and I would suspect that they would appreciate it if Americans would do likewise. That would give us great wisdom in how to address the current crisis. Now, given that it's Good Friday, I wanted to just go to this picture drawing from Rembrandt of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ, which was today, 2,225 years ago, or so, I guess 33 years after that, but about 2,000 years ago. this horrible crucifixion occurred, and you can see Christ wasn't the only one being crucified. Our good friend Reverend James Bevel, who ran as LaRouche's vice presidential running mate, used to make the point that there was an election, because people would say, well, what chance does LaRouche have of winning the election? And Reverend Bevel would say, well, they had an election under Tiberius and Pontius Pilate, and Barabbas won the election. Barabbas did not get crucified. He was allowed to go free, but nobody even knows his name anymore. But the name that people know is that of Christ. And there are churches, and there are followers, and there is a historical legacy. The person who, quote unquote, lost the election of the time was the one whose life actually changed the course of civilization. And I think that's very important for today when we consider what we think has influence. Do you change history through brute force? Bibi Netanyahu said not so long ago that he would, I don't think he said he preferred to be Genghis Khan, maybe he did, but he said the people who said that tyrants were not powerful or were not remembered were wrong. And I think that says something about his entire outlook and what's happening in Gaza right now to the Palestinian population, because while people are extremely frustrated and anguished, rightly so, it is very important to understand, again, what actually shapes history, what will be the legacy that's remembered, what will be enduring in this moment. And it is our job to ensure that the people who are innocent, the people who are not committing horrific atrocities, the people that are trying to do something for the good of mankind as a whole, actually are enduring, not the people who go against the principles of natural law and the universe to impose their will through arbitrary force. And this was also the case, really, of the American Revolution, the first successful revolution against the British Empire. And I just would like to say that today, as well as being Good Friday, is the anniversary of the ride of Paul Revere, which Americans might remember because of the poem, which is shown here. This is not the whole poem, which has quite some of the details, but Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, people have this in their mind. It's, or it used to, they probably don't read this in school anymore, if they even learn English anymore. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea. And I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. And there is one artist's conception of it on the cover of this little magazine, which is where the poem, I suppose, was first published. So that has everything to do with the discussion this evening. And I have two very special guests. One is my husband, Christopher, the vice president of the LaRouche organization. And the other is Anton Chaitkin, historian, author, dear friend. We have been in some battles together against the legacy of the Confederacy and the British Empire in this country. I was just remembering that Tony actually went to jail with Reverend Bevel for going after the Albert Pike statue in Washington, D.C. And he's just completed the second volume in a series, which is very important and very timely right now, Who We Are. And that is the book right there. And it is available on Amazon, and we'll remind you again at the end of this. So I will stop right here because I think Chris has a few things to say also by way of introduction and starting off the discussion. And I'm really glad to have both of you here.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I will be very brief in my introduction, but I just wanted to say that here's the two volumes, volume 1, volume 2, Tony's great historical work. This is years and years of work in these books, and they are not meant to be on the shelves. They're meant to be dog-eared and underlined and everything else. But I'm working on getting the second volume to that point as the first volume. Anyway, last week I had a discussion on this show about the question of the fight between republicanism and the feudal system, going back to Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle being the spokesperson for slavery and oligarchism, and Plato being the spokesperson for republicanism. He wrote the Republic, after all, and the idea of the importance of mankind and the development of all mankind and the potential of the development of all mankind, that nobody was born to be a slave, quote unquote, as Aristotle claimed. But upon reading a good chunk of volume 2 from Tony's book, it just became very clear to me. And so we talked about Cusa, and we talked about what Cusa wrote in the Concordancia Cattolica about, and this is in 1434, again, talking about the right of consent of the governed. And as we know, that's in our Declaration of Independence. But just because it's in the Declaration of Independence doesn't mean that that settled the issue, unfortunately. In fact, this feudal system infected, coming from the the Roman Empire, the Venetian Empire, the British Empire, this infected the United States in the slave system, and we had to become a more perfect union. We had to rid ourselves from that. We still do, in a sense. And that was the mission of people like John Quincy Adams, of people like Henry Clay, of people like Abraham Lincoln, who Tony spends a tremendous amount of time in this volume talking about the fight that Lincoln had, not just in the Civil War, as people know about, or the fight against slavery per se, but in the fight for internal improvements, the fight for actually protective tariffs that would support our capability to manufacture that which could be manufactured in the United States more cheaply, so that the value of labor would be uplifted in the United States. So I would like to just introduce Tony to come on in and tell us a bit about his thinking on this and his books. And go ahead.
Okay, good. Thanks, Chris and Diane. Tomorrow is the 250th anniversary of the first battle in Lexington and Concord, first battles of the American Revolution. So what was that conflict about? What was it really about? To understand this, you really have to have the setting for it. In the years just previous to this, in the 1760s into the 1770s, there was a different kind of revolution going on in England, which was gaining new powers to produce. And this was the steam engine project, the canals, certain scientific breakthroughs with Priestley and so forth. And suddenly, as a result of these gentle people, they were pro-Americans and they were anti-slavery people. They were all friends of Franklin, who was directing a lot of what they were doing. He was there for 18 years. But suddenly, as a result of their breakthroughs with industry and science and technology, suddenly there was the power for the entire world to become advanced and enlightened, to have good lives. And the leaders of the British Empire at that time, who were, when they were in the American Revolutionary fight, the fight against the colonies, came to the determination that no other country would be allowed to have these powers, that they would be locked into only the empire, steam power and these other things, metallurgy. The Americans were in a terrible bind. They had been blocked from having industry by the British colonial overlords. But now, with this industrial revolution in England, they had to have advanced industry to maintain any kind of real sovereignty or independence, to have self-government. The self-government has a content to it. It's not just elections. It's not just, I'm going to vote for somebody. Do we have the right to have progress towards a better life, to be treated like human beings, as individuals and as a people? And it turns out that when you understand the context, you have to have that sovereignty, which means economic advancement and industrialization. If you don't become an industrial power, you're going to be slaves. One of the ways that the British kept the Americans from getting the industrialization until the 19th century was by maintaining the slave system in the United States. And the Southern plantation system was part of the British Empire. We should discuss some of these things. I'll bring up a couple of points from Volume 2, which I think are instructive for us right now. Donald Trump is getting world headlines for his tariffs. And in the 19th century, the center of the economic nationalists, the protectionists, the center for that was in Philadelphia. And the people that were promoting this point of view, this political point of view that you need high tariffs, were centered around the Pennsylvania Railroad. They were all apostles of Henry Carey. And so during the Civil War and right after the Civil War, these men determined that the United States had to have a steel industry of its own. Railroads wouldn't work without it. You can't have iron rails, it'll fail. They saw that in the Civil War. And so these men built a steel industry from scratch. There were no steel mills until the Pennsylvania Railroad people set up the first steel mill in what was called Steelton, Pennsylvania. And then they organized other people to set up steel mills. Now, at the same time, as they were doing this as a national project for the development of the country, it wasn't just for private profit. This was for the opening up all kinds of industries. At the same time, they were promoting the development of other nations' steel and railroads. And the right of our nation and any other nation to rise as a power, which was denied by those setting the rules for the world, or thinking they had the right to set those rules, namely, at that time, the British Empire. What was the rule? The rule was no other country is going to advance into industrial power. The rules sometimes went under the guise of free trade. No nation has the right to interfere with trade, with tariffs or any other way. So this has to be really clearly thought through by Americans today. The people that built the steel industry, that organized the whole industry, not just set up the first company, they organized the whole thing for 20 years. One of the people they brought into it was Andrew Carnegie, coming in later. Those men who built our steel industry also organized the power of other countries and protected those other countries to do the same. So it was a principle of self-government that they were for. That's nationalism. That's American nationalism. It's not fascism. It's not oligarchy. It's the idea of self-government. You could ruin self-government by having slavery in a big part of your country, because that's not the self-government of the people in the slave area. It's not the self-government of the slaves. They don't have self-government. So the other thing I just wanted to bring up here is what happened in Reconstruction. This after the Civil War. And this is in chapter 8 of the book. Chapter 7 is the steel chapter. The astonishing thing there is that the economic nationalists were the great stalwart champions of Black empowerment and rights after the Civil War. And it was the liberal financiers and free trade faction up in Boston that abandoned the Black people of the country after slavery was formally abolished. They were said to want to have cheap labor on the plantations still after the war, so that they could get cheap cotton for their mills. But it's much more than that. It has to do with not allowing any underclass to have any power. So what was the program for Reconstruction by those who really wanted to change the situation of the Black people in the South who had been freed of slavery? The program was completely transform the South, bring in immigrants who were skilled, connected by railroads, and change it from an agrarian backward place to a modern industrial place, use the resources of the South to develop the South. Why is that important? It failed because the financiers were gaining too much power, and that's the establishment that has took over. Morgans and they're coupled with Southern politicians and landowners. But why is that so important now? Because the poverty in the world, to overthrow poverty, to overthrow oppression of all kinds, you have to have a complete reconstruction of the economy and society. It doesn't mean you're imposing some social model or some culture, but it means that there's no escaping the need of any people, any nation, to have industrial capabilities, powerful steel mills, powerful nuclear plants, participation in the space program, very, very effective water programs, and so forth. Completely modern times. There is no escape from poverty. There's no escape from oppression without that kind of reconstruction. So, I have the detailed story of this fight. Thaddeus Stevens and Pig Iron Kelly fighting for completely ending the plantation system. We have to do that now in the world. And so the background of our present headlines is, can you be humane and powerful at the same time? The two go together. You don't have one without the other.
Tony?
Yeah.
I wanted, if you don't mind, if you want to continue your thought, go ahead. But
Sure, go ahead.
I just think this point that you made is so important and so foreign to Americans today who think of everything in terms of zero-sum game or grading on the curve. I think the bell curve, grading on the curve was one of the most evil things that was ever done, because the way you get ahead is you're better than somebody else, right? And we have this mantra now, peace through strength. We don't mean peace through our strength, through our industrial might, right? We mean peace through, we're going to bludgeon you into submission, which isn't really very peaceful at all. It's a kind of, but it does seem that from what you're saying, that the founders of our republic had a very clear idea that actually it was to our benefit for other nations to also become free and prosperous. And if you could elaborate on that a bit more, I think it would be really useful.
Well, if you just reverse the phrase, it works out a little bit better. Instead of saying be free and prosperous, be prosperous and free. Because we don't want to tell them how they're going to copy us and be free. First of all, I didn't notice that our government in recent decades is allowing us a lot more freedom than we had in the past. But the issue for these other countries is to dispel all of the excuses for poverty. There's one of the inflection points for this was when from Lincoln up through Grant, President Grant, in the 1860s into the 1870s, we had a policy towards both China and Japan of working in every way we could to promote their rise as modern powers, and with great respect for their cultures, admiration for their cultures, and acknowledging that they had been suppressed by various factors, internal as well as external, colonial, imperial oppression, feudalism, etc. But Lincoln had a policy of trying to reverse the horrifying disrespect of the so-called West, including the United States, for China. The United States, when it was governed by the slave owners in the 1850s, went along with the British disrespect for China and got a treaty to say that China has no rights and we can do whatever we want with China. Well, Lincoln sent an ambassador there, Burlingame, and the Chinese sent him back later on as their ambassador, and they made a treaty with the United States in 1868 during Reconstruction, which was based on mutual respect between the United States and China. And this was about the last article of that was about railroads and telegraphs, saying that if China decides they want these things, then at that point, the United States is committed to send them experts that will help them to develop these things. This is obviously a country that has massive potential because they half invented the world civilization. So of course they can rise. What happened is that after Grant, the country started going downhill under the influence of this northeastern financier faction allied to London. And they were promoting racial and xenophobic theories about Asia. What was the real reason for that? Workers thought that they were protecting their jobs by saying we shouldn't have Chinese immigrants here. But what was really going on is that this faction of transatlantic hooligans, bankers, and followers of the crown did not want the United States to have any influence in the world. If we broke up this respectful two-way development policy with China and with Japan, then the United States would lose all of its influence in Asia. Today, we don't have influence in Asia. We have some powers, but it's not based on the success of the United States. Largely, it's based on the residual power to bully people. Really, the influence that we had was massive. It was our example with the rise of our people, based on a national mission of progress. This was the spark plug for the whole world's development. First in the earlier 19th century, all the way from the Revolution, but then after Lincoln was successful with the Union. And it was right after Lincoln's martyrdom that the U.S. rose like a meteor, shooting up like a spaceship, rose to power, and we got every industry developed because it was our commitment to improve the life of the population. That was that gave us immense influence. When we dropped that and put the law through in 1883, the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was a tragic loss of influence. The British were able to gain the upper hand in Japan and make them an ally of Britain as an imperial power against China, against Russia, and against the United States. And the result at Pearl Harbor may have been much later, but it's completely predictable based on what happened there. So the people that disrespected China, who were working people or their representatives, their honest representatives, made a tragic error because their interests were not served. The steel industry was developed for our national interest. The other country's national interest coincided with ours. Everybody in a position of influence in national life in our country has understood that at a certain time. The fact that people will not discuss this today, even though it's certainly widely known. This is not some great secret. The fact that we have common interests with these other countries. This is a code, I've likened it to omerta in the mafia. That's what rules politics in the United States. Trump challenged the system with tariffs. He made fun of different aspects of the system, but he will not, and that's useful, the green malarkey and the various kinds of perversions that are promoted by these guys from Cambridge and Oxford or whatever. But he nor anyone else will soberly and calmly go before the people. You don't have to be the president to do this. Anybody can become a Lincoln or an FDR by doing this. That's how they did. That's how they became what they were. They changed. FDR changed his views. What you have to do is you have to be able to communicate to the people. This is what we did. This is what our philosophy was. And there's a tragedy in the works here because we're not doing that now. We're a menace to the world and to ourselves. There are certain things we have to do. Again, we made a great change based on terrible errors in our national mission. Every other country like Russia, Glaziev and other people know about this change. Putin certainly knows about this change, and he's spoken about it also, Putin has. But it is really I think, the obligation of every aware person in other countries as well as in our own country to call the United States to account for giving up this idea of universal progress. We used to have that idea. We didn't have it all the time, but we had it. And this made all the difference in world history. So people have the right to call our country to account. If you're not respectful of the United States itself for its past achievements, then you don't understand enough to be able to criticize it right now. But if you do know that, you have to be able to call the country to account for the crimes that the U.S. and the British and the other parts of this wicked system are doing now, and to say this is who we have been in the past, this is what we've accomplished. Go back to that, and we can make progress together. That has to happen now.
Great. It looks like Chris, did you have something you wanted to say? I also have.
Well, just on this,
ahead.
I mean, just on this question of Russia, because you bring, I mean, first of all, you have this quote from Lincoln in chapter 4. He talks about the Civil War, and he says, this is essentially a people's contest. On the one side of the Union it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form of substantive government whose leading object is to elevate the conditions of mankind, right?
That's
This
right.
is not about, I mean, he's very conscious, Lincoln's very conscious, this is not just about America first or something like this. And I'm not saying that in some kind of disrespectful way to President Trump, because I really do think that President Trump intends to uplift the conditions of life in the United States. And you know, I look at it more like we have to be the king's mirror, you know, and he's not king, but the president's mirror, right? That we have to represent this higher idea of American republicanism, and remind him of that. But also on this question of Tsar Alexander II and the freeing of Russia's 23 million serfs, March 3rd, 1861. 2 years before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But, you know, clearly, if you look at the, you know, in other words, it didn't just come out of nothing that Russia sent fleets to New York City and to San Francisco on behalf of the U.S. Republic against the British and the French oligarchical treachery of support of the Confederacy to break apart the Union. That this and Alexander II, like Lincoln, is assassinated by this unholy alliance between the feudal oligarchs, the so-called right, the boyars, and the so-called left of the British stable of, you know, of anarchists and radicals who assassinate Alexander II because he's attempting to do what Lincoln did. So this is an international project, and I think that's what you're getting at. And I, you know, it's, again, this question of who we are, right? That's the fundamental question for Americans right now, because it's not just about America. It's about our mission to free all of mankind from this feudal slavery, right? We're not serfs, and we don't want anybody on the planet to be serfs of a feudal system. And that's the power, I think, of what comes out in your series, among many other things. But
I want to do just one quick advertisement for this volume. This is the first detailed history of the background of American nationalism. This one's about the 19th century. I had it for the 18th century in the first volume. I'm determined to live long enough and be, you know, keep my marbles as long as I can to do the third volume. But for example, the partnership of Abraham Lincoln and Henry C. Carey is developed in this on many different levels, in the agriculture, development movement in the in Lincoln's nomination for president, in the policy making, in the foreign policy. So you could say that the Lincoln era, the intensive part of that, was from 1860 to, or maybe a year before, when Lincoln himself was rising, up to 1879 when Carey died. And it was in that period of 20 years, with the history that I've developed in here, that the format, the theme, the understanding of how you had to proceed was developed for the entire world, for the people who wanted to get progress. I wish we could get back to the use of the word progressive, just like the word gay and some other words, right? Because it has to do with progress, not some silliness or clownishness. But the detailed fight of these two sides, which is not commensurate, is the core history of the United States throughout our existence as a country. And on the one side, the people who are not only promoting a policy, but are actually doing the work to build the industries and to do the inventions. That includes Edison a little bit later. And the Wright brothers, who are not even in this volume, really. But on the other side are the people who, yes, they're trying to stop these people from doing that, from making that advancement, but they have the strangest, constantly stranger and stranger view of what should happen in the world. Now we climaxed by the strange society that we've witnessed in the last, in the last decade or so. But the power to obliterate civilization versus the power to bring it forward and to develop every aspect of it. All the scientists, of every country, including England, all the scientists, all the greatest artists, all of the greatest inventors, and I'm not talking about certain cultists and other people that are celebrated today. All of them had the same kind of concept. I guess I have a quote from, or a paraphrase from Mendeleev. The periodic table. Is that, do I remember his name correctly?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's right. Yeah. So where a peasant was supposed to have asked him, what is science? What do you mean by science? And he said, science is where there's no question of money. And when two scientists are having a discussion, it's never about money. Maybe I don't have it exactly right, but you get the idea. So that's the history. And it's so, when you start doing a historical investigation, and I a lot of the the detailed footnotes and sources that I've got available for people in this work give you the chance to do your own work and to go way beyond what I've been able to do. But when you do this kind of work with this perspective in mind, and you're looking for those who wanted to move human beings forward, it's so exciting to see this as a rule that it always comes up. There's the heart and the soul and the humor and the curiosity and the excitement about ideas which you find in children. You don't maybe find a morality in the children, but you'll find the other things, the curiosity and the excitement. But it always happens that way. And so it's so much fun to be able to do this. I need help from everybody to get these books and to help to publicize this so we can fight for this kind of an outlook together.
Great. There's a few questions actually from YouTube and some things that I wanted to bring up, but in a minute, from the Bronx and from Dennis Speed, a note. Several of us have just discussed the author Edgar Poe moments before this program began. In that discussion, the following quote was read from a 1978 document by Lyndon LaRouche, The Clinical Significance of Poe's Critics. Quote, early in the course of my discussions of Poe with Allan Salisbury, I found myself voicing the concept that sprang forcibly into my mind. Poe was certainly some sort of intelligence operative working at a high level in the U.S. interest. Salisbury replied with some facts, which coincided with that judgment. The hypothesis soon gained the quality of a certainty. The basis for the original hypothesis was that there are outstanding features of Poe's work, including his selection of adversaries, which could not have prevailed as they did unless Poe were governing his post-1831 literary efforts by overriding intelligence professional concerns. On this basis, I propose that further investigations concentrate on the circumstances surrounding Poe's separation from West Point to the purpose of determining the nature of the official or private form of the intelligence organization for which Poe was in fact a leading operative, end quote. And then the question is, can you discuss what this intelligence agency was, what the significance of Poe's relationship to West Point was, who his adversaries in Britain and Scotland were? Second, how do people who have never done this historical investigation do real such investigations, not just internet research?
Well, I guess I would start. I mean, I only know a little bit of what to say about this. In West Point, there was a great change there after the War of 1812 that made it into this world-class engineering school, and the people involved, led by this guy General Swift, were doing things that isn't it all discussed by our historians. I had that in volume 1, setting up of the forge, the foundry there. So this is certainly a multi-generational intelligence and strategy making organization. It definitely overlaps with a lot of what DeWitt Clinton and other people were doing in New York. It certainly overlaps with what people of goodwill were doing in the eastern part of the U.S. South, in Virginia and down into the Carolinas. So I guess the first thing that people, one aspect of this is to look at what was, how did this change come about? How was it crushed at West Point to the point where treason ruled at West Point just before the Civil War? The result of this was tremendous in our history. The development of the railroads and other things. The people that were promoted by this went like the guy that went to Russia to build the first railroad in Russia in the 1840s, who was a West Point engineer. Poe, go to the end of the story, Poe was murdered. And there's a book by his, if I remember correctly, by his physician, which you can get. It's a short book about what happened in his killing that goes against the slanders of Poe, and also gives you a sense of the terrifying pressure and hostility against him. They're not, it's only indirectly indicated, but you get it directly. You get the sense of this terrible venom from the enemy against what Poe represented. He was a Southerner. He was in Baltimore. He was in others in Virginia, and I think he was in Carolina as well. But he was somebody that that was part of universal culture from there. My favorite little indication of that was his story about the man who was all used up, the Southern general who was a great Indian killer and had medals from his campaigns to murder the Indians. And Poe showed him, it was sort of like a little fantasy or science fiction thing. He had different parts of him that had been blown away in the battles. And when you took off of these artificial limbs and everything, there was nothing left of him. He wasn't even there. So I you know, in many of his works, you have the 2,000 years of philosophy, the people from that, the Aristotle and the other figures in this. So that's I think that you can see in what he's doing a reflection of this furious and frightening, but also exciting and humorous war going on behind the scenes and on the front pages as well. So the historians that don't document this now are just liars. This battle between the empire and the republic was at the center of everything, and he was part of that.
Thanks. I'm going to give you a couple questions from the people watching live that are on YouTube, which I think you may have some fun addressing. One is, the Dixie was the balance to the financiers of the North, and that was destroyed and obliterated. So of course the financiers took over. Okay, that's one. And then another person asks, how would you evaluate the current tariff regime from Trump? Is it going to help alleviate our problems, or is it just going to crash and burn everything?
Okay, well, just to do a brief on the first thing, I wouldn't say that the financiers took over the South. I think that's missing something there. It's true that Morgan came in and took over all the railroads and took over a lot of stuff, and like took over all of Tennessee and had new slaves who were jail prisoners to run the coal mines and things like that. But the fact that that the Reconstruction failed, was betrayed in the 1870s, meant that the Southern, this leftover feudalism, this leftover empire, and you have to include the Southern empire that they tried to do by invading Mexico, invading Cuba, and so forth. This is a cancer, terrible cancer this continued. And to a certain extent, the South took over New York, not the other way around. This continued all the way up through Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. We see this again and again. This is a terrible impediment to our country. Those who say that slavery built the United States are talking out of their rear end. They have no idea what they're talking about. That the slavery was always and continued to be into our present time, this racist Southern idea, and it got up into northern cities and California and so forth. This idea has been our enemy. It's the enemy of our country, and it held us back from developing. What was the other part of the question?
About the current tariff regime. Is it going to
tariffs
help? Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, if you want to discuss tariffs, you have to go back to look at what I'm dealing with in this book. First of all, it's outrageous that anybody would discuss tariffs without discussing the fact that this was the central political fight in our country for a century. How could that be omitted from the discussion? It's, as always, the people for free trade never discuss history. They might say something about the Smoot-Hawley tariff of, under Hoover, and make up something about that, how that caused the Great Depression, which isn't true. But there's no discussion of that the tariff, the idea of protective tariffs was the foundation of Lincoln's party, and that the industries of the United States were all, and of every other country in the world, were developed under protectionism. No nation ever developed without that. And it's as simple as that. That's the history of it. The other part of it is that there was a fight on two sides. What were those two sides? One side was those who were for self-government, for the interest of our people. We have the right to protect our people, to protect their wages, to protect their conditions. And the other side was the empire, those who believed that money and birth and concentration of power in certain cities, and power over trade, and power to coerce and blackmail, power to assassinate, all these ways that you stop people from protecting their people, lying about it all the time. Those are the two sides. That's the history of tariffs. It's bigger than just some tactic. So again, I would stress, if you want to discuss tariffs, have the courage to go back and look at that history and then report to the American people what you found. That in fact, the humane, respectful, fighting spirit for progress included protective tariffs and the direction of credit, other things that were necessary for that, because you can't leave everything to corporations and private interests. You have to have government to interfere with certain things for the benefit of everybody, including manufacturers. So that's the history. If you don't want to talk about that, then you're not really talking about tariffs. I'm sorry. There's no discussion of that. In other words, tariffs right now are not being discussed. I'm sorry to say that. It's a completely incompetent discussion. I've read the book by Lighthizer, who was Donald Trump's trade representative in the first Trump administration. And he talks about tariffs, Henry Clay, Alexander Hamilton, McKinley, not very much on Lincoln. But there's nothing about infrastructure, there's nothing about credit. And then he starts attacking China. So who is on the other side? Oh, well, slave owners. Who else? The free traders. Who were the free traders that everybody knew about and were constantly, hitting at? It was Boston and New York importers and financiers who were in the British orbit. And that's the other side. We have that today. These are the people who say they should govern the world. This is the European Union. This is the war party in Ukraine. It's also the war party in Israel. Gosh, are they the same in the two conflicts? Well, if you go to the heart of this problem, it's the U.S. becoming part of the British Empire. That's the heart of the problem. Israel was born in the Cold War, the particular war developed by Churchill after Roosevelt was safely dead. That's the background of Israel. So if you want to get out of this mess, reverse that damage and the division of the world and the division of people against their own interests and the interests of their neighbors. That's the background of our problems today. That fight between those two sides.
To add, because it's implied, but just to make it more explicit about this tariff question, you have to be protecting something. And you described earlier, we were trying to start we actually had an intention to start a steel industry.
That's right. Yeah.
What exactly are we trying to start? Where are the fledgling industries that we're trying to start? Where is the announcement of the 42,000 miles of high-speed rail that we're building that we are trying to protect? Go on.
This is such a teaching moment that could be done by Trump or by somebody that supports him who's got the public ear. You could go through a lesson on political economy. What do we mean by a supply chain? What are the parts or the raw materials that come into our manufacturing? Where are we going to get these things from? Is it really just wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, with AI and secret weapons that there'll be a basis for manufacturing? No, here's what goes into manufacturing. Here's also, you want to tell the truth and really educate the public? How is it that China, was supposedly eating our lunch for manufacturing? How did that happen? What's the origin of that?
And why would they want to eat our lunch?
Why was he over there? Was he trying to help China? Was he trying to help the United States population by doing that? They were deindustrializing the entire advanced world at the same time as they wanted cheap labor. China judoed that. So if you want to discuss the China question, have respect for what both countries were when they were at their best, and China is at their best right now.
Yes, on this, the excitement of sharing a breakthrough, I saw really, really clearly in David Lilienthal's book, Democracy on the March, about the TVA, because he was so excited about the transformation of the whole Tennessee River Valley from this incredible poverty, malaria-infested, backward area to being prosperous, low-cost electricity, verdant farmland, and, that he said every river, every valley, every place like this on the whole planet can be developed this way. And I know less about the Erie Canal in terms of the impact on the world, but it would seem to me that the people involved in that would have had a similar excitement, because it's certainly, even to this day, as broken down as the state of New York is, the cities that were on the canal, you still see the beauty. They are beautiful cities. They were designed around production. the population of Syracuse increased 40-fold as a result of that canal. And speaking of anniversaries, it is the 200-year anniversary of the completion of that, but maybe you have more that you wanted to say about that.
That's a very important anniversary. And remember that the Erie Canal should be called the Erie Canals, because that project continued and was completed with the building of canals from the Great Lakes down to the Ohio River and then to the Mississippi River from Chicago. That's all one project, so that you could have, and you had the cities that were developed in first in Ohio, like Cleveland on the lake, and all these other cities that sprang into existence as great industrial and cultural centers that had world influence as a result of building canals. And when you started doing the Ohio canals to extend how the Erie Canal was going into the interior, now you're going from the canals down from the Great Lakes down to the Ohio River. And that was a federal project as well as state project. That was funded by Congress and by John Quincy Adams' push. And then Lincoln promoted the Great Canal that made Chicago into the center of world industry as a seaport for both the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean at one stroke, by making this canal connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. And that completed what began as the Erie Canal under DeWitt Clinton. So this, it was the same thing. And remember that what Lilienthal is discussing, what FDR was so excited about, and what he was trying to do in other parts of the country, began doing in Washington State and elsewhere with TVA and in other countries, that this was a continuation of the project that the best people in the North were trying to do, including his own father, FDR's father, which I have this in the book, to build modern railroads in the South and change the South. FDR went back to this project. One of the people who saw the TVA and the kind of progress that this was bringing about was a young man who was in the United States from Africa, from colonial Africa, named Kwame Nkrumah. He was in the United States for 10 years. He went to Lincoln University. He joined up with this American civil rights movement. Then he went back to pass the Statue of Liberty on his way out on the boat and cried looking at this. And he went back to the Gold Coast and changed it into Ghana, and they kicked the British out. And he tried to do it with Eisenhower. Eisenhower was overruled by his own government. But then it was with Kennedy that Kwame Nkrumah did this project to build a dam whose first model was the TVA, is the great dam on the Volta River. And I know that Eisenhower and Kennedy both were trying to do the same thing in Eastern Africa. And this thing goes all the way back in Ethiopia, back to Haile Selassie. In 1929, he was working with American engineers. Forget about Herbert Hoover. But the idea of building a hydroelectric project there in Ethiopia. Now we have this wonderful Grand Renaissance Dam that's providing electricity for Ethiopia and for neighboring countries. And the warmongers and genocidalists want to have tribal warfare and uprisings and coup d'etats and color revolutions and so forth. But mankind is above the beavers. We do these projects and we can be successful. And that's our history. That's who we are.
That is really exciting. That's really exciting. I have another question from a young friend in the Bronx who happens to be running for Congress about Gouverneur Morris. about his role writing the preamble of the Constitution. And Jose asks if you would say anything about the people like Morris who were anti-slavery, because I know, and we deal with this a lot in the organizing, so many people have gotten this line, of course, and this is the way they falsify our history, and it creates a condition where we're not as good as we should be today, which is that, oh yeah, well, the whole nation was founded by a bunch of slave owners. I mean, you'd have the idea that basically people came over here so that they could set up a second British Empire, as opposed to what our republic was intended to be. So I think he's asking for you to elaborate also on what you know about the anti-slavery dedication of a number of these people who were so instrumental in the American Revolution and the crafting of our Constitution.
Well, the American Revolution started in certain sense in Boston and in Virginia, in the Republican movements there. Boston then, as before, had a Republican faction, and it had a faction of people in the British orbit. And so to get anything really going, you had to escape from Boston at a certain point. You had the Boston Brahmins. These people later developed fascism and everything else. Franklin left Boston, came to Philadelphia as a young man. New York City, Hamilton lived there, and there were great men there. They were, all the way through. But it's also, like Boston, it became a center for this transatlantic, hog pen, and lies, constant lying about everything. Columbia University is really one of the most horrifying examples of world oligarchism in the 20th century. It has a fantastic history. But anyway, so Gouverneur Morris was a New Yorker, but what he contributed in developing the Constitution, he did great work in the convention and elsewhere, had a lot to do with the central, let's say the influence of Franklin and his friends, and a complex of revolutionary and humane leadership in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania. Hamilton also, and that was the capital of the country for 10 years after the Revolution. James Wilson was part of the group with Gouverneur Morris in the Constitutional Convention. These were American nationalists. I think that I've read a lot about Gouverneur Morris being a conservative against the excesses of the French Revolution. But insofar as he was an intelligence person for, George Washington and others, he's not just a conservative. What does that really mean? You have to go for what they understood about what human beings could accomplish. And this idea of a national mission for accomplishment was centered in the Franklin's complex, a lot of which he personally founded, and which had other people adding to it from New York, from Illinois with Lincoln, from Kentucky even with Henry Clay. But this was a center of our revolution in the sense that it was the world headquarters for the full idea of a republic and man's right to advance. So you had this group with Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris. I don't think they were related, and others in this set of men in Philadelphia. Not all of them were of the same caliber. Some of them were more into money and so forth, and there were oligarchs there as well. But this involved a mission expressed in the Philosophical Society, in the University of Pennsylvania, in the industries that grew up in all the inventions of various kinds, and in the idea of national government. And you had people there from all over the world who were intersecting with them, from South America, from Europe, from Asia, all along. So this, I would say to I'm not an expert on Gouverneur Morris, but if you get stuck on the idea that, and you're somehow harping on this, that he was a conservative, and also that he was from New York, and that New York is one thing, and it's a mess, like Philadelphia became after the deindustrialization. It was a horror show, right? It was like a travesty, a clown show in a sense. But if you go back to the period of from the 17, especially the 1740s onward in Philadelphia, you have a complex of scientific, philosophical, industrial, and political leadership there, which continued towards the end of the 19th century. It was even there when representatives of the Tata family came over from India. These are the Parsis originally from Iran, who came from India to try to ask Americans, could we build a steel industry in India, even under the noses of the British, who want us to be backward? And they got in touch with the old Pennsylvania, steel people, and they got an engineer, I think his name was Julian Kennedy, and picked up through Mark Hanna's work. And this guy went back to India with them, and they built the first steel industry in India. So this is a tradition going back to the time of that Gouverneur Morris and his fellow conspirators for mankind were doing this in Philadelphia for a new nation and for a new world that is not, he went to France as the ambassador there, and he wasn't for spreading revolution, so in some empty concept of spreading revolution. So anyway, you have to get this element, this what do you call it? This dimension of real progress, real ambition at the highest ambition for your people. What are we going to accomplish? That was in his mind. That was the America that was centered on this project for building a new country at the time of the American Revolution.
Tony, part of the question that came up earlier, and Chris, you should please say something if you have more, but is research, because nowadays people just tend to quote unquote, Google has become a verb. But
yeah.
I think that the work you do probably isn't Googling things. So maybe you could share how you delve into some of the things that you've looked at and uncovered or put together in your books for this as a model for people who are actually serious and want to understand the true history of this Republican with a small r mission of our nation.
Well, personally, I started by being lucky to have a family. My parents were, took me to Beethoven concerts, and they were into reading and every universal culture. So that was exciting. I was always for justice, and I was searching for some way to do something about that. I was disappointed by the Communist Party. I went looking for the most radical people I could find, and I went on a ship in Italy one time, and there was a guy there from the Communist Party, and he disappointed me by saying, "Oh, don't pay any attention. I'm a member of the Communist Party, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just a party." But then when I got back to the United States, my wife and I, Janice, found LaRouche at a 2-bit little voluntary school on 14th Street. And he began talking not only about the change in the country, but particularly about the universal possibilities for mankind. And one of the important things that we looked into was the role of Plato in history. Wasn't only a philosopher who wrote things and had influence through his writings, but was an activist who interfered with world history and was trying to motivate and work with and outflank those who were trying to crush humanity. So on my own work and with the work of others, but what I saw was that this this kind of bright and optimistic ambition and personality type and so forth was you had this all throughout history in many different fields. And if you start with that and see what there are people that made accomplishments, that did something to advance mankind, start with that, see what they're up against. And if you have that as just as a working, this is not even a hypothesis, just use it as a way of prying open what's going on. There's a kind of a fight, and it has many different aspects to it, but you have to start with that. You have to start with the interesting accomplishments. Some of these we don't know about now, but at all, but we'll find out more. Like what's this history among the indigenous people of the Americas going back to 2,000 years ago? There has to be not only two sides, but interesting individuals and ideas, people that invented corn, people who invented, the irrigation and what have you. But all throughout history, you have this element in science, in statecraft, and in so many different fields. That's how you start. You start by looking at this and saying, I want to know the true story of this. And whenever you find an element that denies that as the universal nature of humanity and their rights and their needs and their and who they could be if they were free to be really human. Anybody that denies that, that there are lies being told in the history. I'm reading a history of nuclear power, and it has tremendous facts. A guy named Mahaffey, I think, wrote it. It's called Atomic Awakening. But there's certain things there about why it was necessary to bomb Japan, why England was always our greatest intelligence ally, and certain other things that you see denying the character that's universal among the greatest of these scientists, for that the women and others who developed nuclear science. If you don't have that element, you're not telling us the whole story. So that still needs to be investigated. What is that history? How do you get to the promise of nuclear energy and nuclear science? It doesn't just start with the bomb. That's a false story. So I don't know the whole story. I have to investigate that for the 20th century story, for the third volume. But the method starts with the accomplishment. What are these people up against? And what is the setting? For my 20th century story, I'm starting with the opposition of the two sides, Franklin Roosevelt versus Montague Norman, head of the Bank of England. But anyway, that's my own method, and I think that's the method that Franklin Roosevelt, when he investigated the American Revolution, he was thinking of this as a great, glorious chapter. He was proud of it for his nation. And he wanted to find out what was going on in Europe about this. He studied, he got thousands of books and read them, especially when he got polio, but otherwise, he just had a huge library, and he became one of the greatest students. But that was his standpoint, this accomplishment. He completely changed his point of view from what he had been when he was in with his cousin Teddy before World War One. But investigating history from the standpoint of being excited about the great advances and how is compassion and scientific advancement. He was very much involved with that. How is that the real story of history? That's what you have to start with.
Thanks. I think that's really.
You'll find out everything.
If you have time, if you have enough hours in the day, I think we need a lot of people working on this. I really thank you for your.
I know. Oh, we have to get more people doing it, right?
Yes. And then we have to make more history in the right direction. That's also part of it.
That's right. That's right. That's how we knew that we were on the right track with what we were talking about in history, because we saw these two sides in action. We were a big part of one side, and we were right up against the other side at the very top. In the old days, we could joke about the fact that we just had a meeting, let's say, with some nasty speculator who's also a thug and a war criminal or something, and we found out some certain things, and then we could predict what a headline was going to be in the newspaper the next day. That wasn't, because we were head to head against the people that were pretty much at the top, or not the very top, but I don't know that people went and had meetings with the royal family and so forth. But anyway, we were in that kind of a fight. And so we knew about these two sides from having experienced it.
Right. That's very true. Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, one thing I was really struck by in your book and was this question of Frederick Douglass. Because look, there's a big lie out there that the quote unquote left pushes, and so would the right. They would be gleeful about it. The left is bitter about it, but it's a damned lie, which is that slavery built the United States. It's an evil, evil lie. And to say that slavery didn't build the United States doesn't take anything away from the horrific suffering of Black Americans in the United States, and a hideously feudal, satanic system of the human use of human beings, as would later be written about, right? But it just, you take John Randolph of Roanoke and what he says about internal improvements, right? If you give the federal government the power to build a national bank and internal improvements, they're going to take your slaves away.
Yeah.
And what Elkanah Watson, who is one of my heroes, because he goes down and he visits George Washington, and he advocates for an Erie Canal in 1785, and Washington is excited by this. And Washington's point, now Washington's a Virginian, right? But he's an American. So Washington doesn't say, well, I want to build the canal in Virginia first. He's excited about building canals, the whole project, as you talked about, the Erie Canal. It's a whole project of the canal and later railroad system in the United States, right? So Washington is thinking about that. Elkanah Watson, he's on a tour. He stops in Virginia, in Mount Vernon, meets with George Washington, discusses this whole question of a canal system. He says, I'm excited because Washington, this is what he's thinking about. And then he goes down to the South, and he's struck not only with slavery, but the poverty of the entire area, right? Unless you were the upper 1%. And even then, could you die of some disease because you live in a totally disgusting, impoverished situation based on a slave system? Yeah, sure you could. But if you were the upper 1%, you probably lived a fairly decent life on some feudal plantation, right? But the average living conditions of everybody, slave, poor, white, were hideous. And so I was really struck by this question of Frederick Douglass versus Garrison, because Garrison pushes this lie that the United States was built on slavery, and Douglass says no, the United States was founded against slavery. So if you think, well, I'm a noble person and I'm against slavery, and I therefore say the United States was built on slavery, well, you're going directly against the truth of the Declaration of Independence, the truth of the fight. What side are you on, right? And Frederick Douglass said at a certain point, he broke from this. He said, no, absolutely not. Actually, the United States was not built on slavery. It was not founded on slavery. It was founded on this principle of ending slavery, ending tyranny, and freeing mankind from that. So these are just some.
I think one part of that, Frederick Douglass after the Civil War wrote a lot about economic policy. He was a protectionist, and he wrote about exposing the lies of the free traders and the idea of cheap labor that's embodied in so-called free trade. Now, one of the things that's missing from the current discussion of tariffs is, what was the idea of the slave owners? They were the greatest enemies of protectionism and of protective tariffs. Now, there are people on both sides who do things for different reasons. I think probably Rockefeller, back in the early 20th century, was for high tariffs. It doesn't really matter at that point because it's not relevant here. But why were the slave owners opposed to protective tariffs? Why was the Confederacy? Why was it in their Constitution of the Confederacy at war with America, saying you can't have protective tariffs? What's the point? It goes back to Jefferson. And it says, and to the Shelburne and the British, and the idea is that we do not want the United States to become an advanced, powerful nation. We don't want a republic here that is going to influence people to have the common people of our country and the world to be ambitious. If they're skilled, they're going to want to be ambitious. We don't want that. We don't want cities. We don't want books except for stupid, feudalistic novels that we read while we're sipping our whiskey on the front porch and other people are working. So the reason that they gave for not wanting protective tariffs is they did not want to have industrialization. They didn't want to have industry for the country, because that would change the character of the country and would take away their power. So, and that's true for all empires and all imperialism. No country could be allowed to protect their people and therefore develop the industry that would make their people, that would elevate their people. This is the biggest embarrassment to the free trade idea. And I believe that what's already happened with the campaign, as well as just all the rhetoric, of these, I guess you call them right-wing protectionists. I'm not even characterizing Trump. I'm just talking about whatever. What's already happened has already made it impossible to have the former regime of worldwide poverty based on imposing free trade. That's dead. You can't go back to that. So we're in a big crisis now. What's going to replace that? Are we going to have cooperation between the big countries to make progress? Or are we going to just go down in flames? But you're not going back to this globalism. Globalism is the imposition of rules by a monopoly of the powers of production in certain centers of the world. That is to deny those powers to other people and get fools in the younger generation and elsewhere to claim that you're doing this to protect the environment or that there's corrupt dictators in Africa or something, and that's why there's poverty. No, nobody believes that now. It's just a question of whether people have the right to have a good standard of living. And of course, you have to have protectionism for that. Every country has to be able to protect their people, and you cooperate between the countries. Trump's already talked about that. That's already since McKinley. That's certainly what Franklin Roosevelt did. He didn't get rid of tariffs. He was for a reciprocal arrangements with other countries. But he was looking out for his own country, because if we didn't succeed, if we didn't become powerful, then we would have no influence. So the history of this goes back to slavery and the effect of the slave owners on keeping our country backward and powerless for generations until we had to fight this terrible bloody civil war. That's the history of it. If you're for free trade, then you are for slavery. You're for slavery in the form that it existed then, where colored people of different colors around the world today live in bad conditions and are hungry and don't have industry. That's what free trade and the rules are about, is to keep people in poverty and backwardness. That's what it was when the slave owners exercised power over our country and tried to make war on the countries to the south to spread slavery. That's the problem right there. That's what free trade and protectionism is really all about.
I think in a sense, this evil really comes not from national governments, although you certainly have some idiotic governments, as we see in the European Union, trying to keep the war with Russia going on forever. But these big multinational corporations such as BlackRock or Vanguard, or these these conglomerates that have enormous amounts of shares in this and that and seem to dictate policy. I mean, I think take the Europeans right now. They're saying, well, if the United States no longer is interested in having a war with Russia, then we're going to have it on our own, and we're going to spend 800 billion euros on defense. They don't even have the industry to produce that. So, it's sort of a shell game of moving money around to benefit some corporate whatever they think that they're doing. And meanwhile, the population suffers. I mean, this is going to be, and then to enforce it, they have to cancel elections or put people in jail if they're running for office.
People are being jailed and killed who are in the opposition all over Europe. It's amazing. Yeah, I kind of think of, I did an article on my Substack, what do you call it, the subscription thing, couple of times, posts ago, about contrasting Teddy Roosevelt to Lincoln. And on the one hand, you have Lincoln's program for developing powers in the population, science powers, educational powers, and infrastructure powers. So that's Lincoln and his ambition. And on the other side, what was Teddy Roosevelt for? I kind of just, you have to sort of, it seems to me, you have to start with the most obvious thing is that his faction, his allies, his friends, his family are murderers. They're killers. And that's the other side. It's a killer elite. And that's certainly what he did with Edward VII, who was the Prince of Wales in the, leading up to when he was king when Teddy Roosevelt became president. And together they reorganized intelligence of the two countries to start a great war. It was always the idea of a great war. Teddy Roosevelt thought war was good for its own sake. Actually, Lincoln had the idea of man being above the animals, and Teddy Roosevelt had his own idea of man being above the animals. He would go and murder the animals, right? That was his big thing with a big gun, J.P. Morgan had a funny quip when Teddy Roosevelt went to Africa one time after he was president to go there to slaughter the animals. J.P. Morgan said, "I hope that the lions will do their duty," meaning that they will go ahead and die for Teddy Roosevelt when they are shot by him. I thought that was pretty funny. But that's the other side. And you have that right up through, look, what's NATO? NATO is this whole group of insane adventurers. How do they think they would get away with this stuff? The bombings, the killings, the underground movements of Nazis and UFO freaks and God knows what, everything. You have this still going on. That's NATO. That's the underground of NATO. What are they for? Are they for free trade? You could say that, and you could say it's corporations. But I have history in my book, I have a history of some corporations like these companies in Philadelphia that did a world of good, at certain times, especially for quite a long time. In the Pennsylvania Railroad, the what do you call it? The locomotive company and machine companies. Well, what are these big, huge international, really, really huge international corporations? What are they really? What's really in there if you get not into the boardroom, but the other relationships that they have? They're freaks. They're killers. They're not. They don't see themselves as human. They don't like the idea of human. And this is a brotherhood or a whatever of criminals of the closest thing that most people would know about this would be people on dope, and probably they have that too, and people with various sexual adventures and so forth. But this goes back all the way. That's what you're talking about. People who are really crazy with the idea of power. I'm going to keep my power, and I'm going to make everybody else just completely desperate and broken down in order for me to keep my power. What kind of a world would you ever have? What's the future of that? Is that really a sane thing? Is it really, for an interest? It is an interest, and the interest is a little bit lower down, the stockholders or something like that. But these guys setting a policy to have these wars, what would Jewish people do? Murdering tens of thousands of people day after day after day after day. What kind of Jewish person? What are they looking forward to happening to the Jews? What do they think is going to happen? So this is an international gang clique connected in different ways between these countries, Israel, Britain, Ukraine, God knows what, all the stuff, into New York, into these universities, Pentagon, certain parts of the quiet room in the Pentagon, completely crazy killers. And that's the other side. To me, that's what I think. And that's really what you're up against. So you have to get the straitjackets out, and you have to say, we have an interest, and we have much more power than they do if we just get together between the countries. They have no power to withstand the public. And Trump and anybody else could get 80% of the vote if they represent the interest of the population in advancement. Everybody will go for that. They'll go for all these beautiful things, including nuclear power and everything else they're afraid of, including classical music, all these things. It has a wonderful audience and appreciation if it's simply people are allowed to have these things. You could get a huge majority for that. So we want to get new leadership based on people looking at what we've accomplished in civilization and reporting that back to the people, and just having the courage to tell the truth about that past and that future.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we're about at time to wrap up. I would like to ask Dave to put your book on the screen again so people know what it is and can order it, and ask if you have any parting words, Tony, first of all, about anything.
Where do people get that book?
You have to get it from Amazon, or you don't actually have to do it, but ultimately it'll come from them because they're printing it. But you can order it in any bookstore, and they can order it. It's 600 pages. It has 48 pages of pictures and a really good index and a very detailed table of contents with very interesting section heads. And I would recommend, of course, getting both volumes, volume 1 and volume 2. Unfortunately, that's 1,000 pages between the two of them. And, a couple of years from now, I'm going to come out with a third one. So you better get cracking.
Right. And I will just say, if you have the picture of Treason in America, which is the other side that Tony also did, very important for many of us in this fight. And I think, Tony, what you said about how you learn about the evil of these people is you get involved and you fight. When you fight for the good, then you realize by who's shooting at you what you're up against.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
Who drew
sort of-
that cover picture on the cover? Do you remember?
No,
Who made that drawing?
I don't know. I think this book was printed before I came around.
Before you were born.
Not quite.
That's Major Andre, right?
It's Major Andre hanging, but the drawing was by Alexander Hamilton.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I had
And
no idea.
I didn't do it. Put that on the cover. I don't like capital punishment. I would never. I'm very timid person, among other things, and so I would not ever want to kill anybody. But the reason I have that there is because Major Andre represents, this other element, who are so polite and so forth, and yet they're killing people all over the place. Not poor, what's his name, Benedict Arnold, who was his dupe, and he was a disappointed person, and yeah, he was a traitor. But the issue is, have some fun in looking into these things. Have some excitement in this kind of research, and you try to have it be as cheeky as you can about it, and then you'll be successful.
If you go to the site where Major Andre, where they believe he was hanged, up in just across the border in New York, the crazy thing about it is that they now have a little monument to him where they say this just doesn't make any sense because the British, we're such close allies with the British now.
Yes.
that
I know.
It seems like such a tragedy that we ever hung such a fine man as this, because we're just the best of friends now.
Yeah.
It's like what a whitewash of what the issue is.
Well, if you go to the history of science, and what I'm finding in the nuclear science is that there's these wonderful British scientists going back to the 1600s and all throughout their history. And each one of these people that did some really good stuff was in some way, excited about, about things from the standpoint of an image of man in their mind. I mean, they were Quakers, they were some other dissenters, they were something, they were part of something other than, the East India Company. So this is everywhere. And, this is what human beings are really all about, including people in England. And it was right for Franklin Roosevelt to help England and help the British to stand up to Hitler, knowing as fully as he did that the British government and elite, along with our financiers, put Hitler into power. He knew that. He could barely get any laws passed against their power and against the power of the Southerners. But he is trying to fight the worst results of these evil men. And once the war was coming to an end, he wanted to have a world that had the power to go in a direction that these people didn't want, with a direction of progress for everybody. So, he's right to help those people anywhere in England or in all the other countries to stand up to the results of this imperialism, which was Hitler, Mussolini, Tojo, all of them coming, promotions of imperialism. So anyway,
Great.
stay tuned, more
Yes.
to come.
Thank you so much. And I will just say, please watch this space tomorrow at 2 p.m. Chris, myself, Dennis Speed will be speaking about the and Robert Wesser 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and the few hundred years of struggle that led into that, and some of Alexander Hamilton and Lyndon LaRouche's work that came after that. So tomorrow, Saturday, 2 p.m. And thank you, Tony, and everybody. Have a happy Easter and happy American Revolution.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.